Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming here today. My name is Ashton Smith. I'm a research assistant with the University of Michigan Center on Finance, Law, and Policy. Um, we are glad to have you here today. Welcome to Assessing Federated Machine Learning's Potential for Transforming KYC/AML. Before we get started, I'd like to share with you a few expectations for our breakout session. First, please note that this session will be recorded, as you probably just got a notification for. For this reason, we ask that you please keep your video turned off. This will help us keep the gallery view on the panelists. Second, we also ask that you please keep yourself muted if you are not speaking. And then finally, we'll have a Q&A at different points throughout the breakout session. We encourage you to participate and ask questions, and please include your questions in the chat specifically where they'll be moderated. Finally, let's all welcome today's presenter, PR Stark.
Thank you, Ashton. And thank you to the entire University of Michigan San Francisco Fed teams. We're very pleased for the opportunity today and grateful to all the work you have done. Our purpose, as Ashton suggested, is to present to all of you a proposal for research that explores an elegant and potentially transformative technology for improving how we do BSA AML risk assessment around the globe. Before we get into that, I want to give a little bit of context about who we at FinRegLab are and how we came to bring this proposal to you today. Many of you will know FinRegLab is an independent nonprofit research organization. We evaluate new technologies and data to inform both public policy and market practice on the smart and safe use of innovation in financial services. In a sense, our work occurs at the intersection of innovation, policy, and people. Innovation, as I said, we tend to focus on new technologies and new uses of data that can improve how financial services are offered. Policy, we try to identify specific areas and questions where law, policy, and regulation may need to evolve to permit and shape the fair and responsible use of these innovations. And people, over time, we disproportionately focus on uses of innovation that can help improve the way the financial services meets the needs of its customers, particularly those who have been historically excluded from access. We believe deeply that the combination of better data and better technology can improve how we assess risk in a variety of forums. Many of you will have seen FinRegLab's early work on the use of cash flow data in small business and consumer underwriting. We found there that better data helps improve risk prediction, which creates space to lend to more people. What we're talking about today is another application of the same hypothesis. As I said, the use of federated learning is an elegant and potentially transformative technology. It's a way to better understand the risk of criminal activity that touch the financial services world around the world, and to improve how we can separate real risk from those who might look risky using current techniques. In this way, federated learning presents a true paradigm shift in how financial crimes compliance occurs. It can improve the access to information by expanding the data sets available to those doing risk identification, making information about threats more timely, and do this without actually sharing data across firms or between law enforcement agencies and private sector actors. It represents a much broader trend in risk management, which is a shift away from a sort of reactive, check-the-box, rules-based compliance world to one that is proactive, data-driven, and focus more on detection than reactivity. And finally, we're going to think about throughout how these improvements affect inclusion, how we can open the door to the financial services world to people who currently can't get in by improving risk prediction, enabling better allocation of resources, and reducing costs along the way. Our conversation today is going to have four main parts, and we encourage you, as Ashton said, to raise your hands, send in questions. I'll do my best in each segment to work you in. The first is really going to lay the table. We're going to talk about the policy purposes of the global BSA AML regime and current practice. We're then going to turn to the technology of federated learning itself and explain a little bit about how it works and why we think it can help improve risk prediction and inclusion in this context. We'll talk a little bit about those in the system and what they need to know about how this technology works, what it means for them, their ability to meet legal and regulatory responsibilities, and to pursue their businesses. And finally, we'll take up the central mandate of the conference and consider the implications for the central bank of the future. To help me along the way, I have found two superbly qualified panelists, and let me give you a brief introduction to each. I'm joined by Dr. Gary Shiffman, the founder and CEO of Giant Oak. He is an economist by training and a leader in the modeling of risk related to combating illicit violence, coercion, and financial crime in many forms. He comes to this space as a Navy veteran, as well as with a tour in government as a national security professional in the Senate and at the Department of Homeland Security. He teaches in his spare time at Georgetown, and I learned this morning, actually authored a book this year on the economics of violence. We're also joined by the Honorable Juan Zarate, who was the first ever Assistant Secretary for the Treasury for terrorist financing and financial crimes. In that capacity, he was the architect of the post 9/11 AML and sanctions regime expansion in the United States. He also served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism. We are very grateful to both of them for joining us today. And without further ado, let me start with you, Juan. You were quite literally present for the creation of the contemporary global AML regime. Can you give us a bit of an introduction to the core policy purposes that regime serves?
Absolutely, PR. And first of all, let me thank you and Melissa and Aaron at FinRegLabs for inviting me to be a part of this great discussion, and obviously the San Francisco Fed and the University of Michigan for hosting. I think what happened post 9/11 PR was quite dramatic in the context of the anti-money laundering system and how we thought about the use of financial tools and measures and regulation for purposes of not just law enforcement and financial criminality, but also national security. And so what you had post 9/11 was really a paradigmatic shift to use the system, that is to say the anti-money laundering system, the Bank Secrecy Act as it was evolving, to use sanctions, targeted sanctions and other financial measures as a central tool of national security, and in that sense, to be preventative in its outlook. And that became, in some ways, the driving impetus for how the Patriot Act expanded the Bank Secrecy Act to include more regulations, more regulated sectors. It drove the use of sanctions in different conduct-based applications, first terrorist financing, then proliferation finance, later cyber malicious activity, in the case of Global Magnitsky, corruption, human rights. And what you've had emerge is really a system that is being asked to prevent illicit activity on a global scale that has national and international security import. What was dramatic in that was the system had really been designed and built to help law enforcement build cases around drug money laundering. That was really the origins of the Bank Secrecy Act, and then the global anti-money laundering system as articulated by organizations like the Financial Action Task Force, OECD, and others. What happened post 9/11 was you had this shift in focus of looking at the use of the system preventatively, thinking about these tools, not just as tools of national security, but also as fundamental tools of financial regulation, which is to say, our ability to prevent illicit finance was a core principle for central banks and finance ministries around the world to protect the integrity of the financial system, which is now almost a common mantra we hear over and over again, whether you think about the G20 statements, G7 statements, or things that come from the Fed or the Treasury. In addition, there was a sense that the financial sector in particular, but also the regulated sectors writ large, had a much deeper responsibility to discover and manage risk within their enterprises and as a systemic risk. Again, the challenge here, PR, was the prior system was really built around case building and reactive, unitary ways of looking at financial information and data. It was about following the money, but it was about following the money after the fact, and institution by institution, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. And it was largely up to the regulators to make sure that institutions had the right programs and processes and screening in place. And it was up to the financial intelligence units, in the case of the US FinCEN, to try to put the pieces together by looking through the mountain of suspicious activity reports and currency transaction reports. All of that was really important post 9/11. But the core point here, PR, as a starting point for our discussion is that design never met the policy demands that we've put on the system, not to mention the complexity of a global system that's growing ever more complicated as we speak. And so we've been in search of, we've been writing about, we've been thinking about what is the next design of the system that allows the system to be much more effective at discovering systemic risk, that is much more efficient so that institutions and even regulators aren't spending their time worrying about the number of SARs filed as opposed to the number of systemic cases discovered. And how can you do that in a way that respects and actually drives the key policy goals of protecting the integrity of the financial system, preventing these international security issues from getting worse by being fueled through the financial system, and protecting data and privacy at the same time. And that's what's led Gary and me to, and you, of course, PR, to this, as you said, quite elegant and potentially revolutionary technology that I think cuts the Gordian knot and allows us to drive those policy goals with a new design driven by this new technology.
There's a lot to unpack there. Thank you, Juan. The first place I want to sort of follow up is around the counterbalancing sort of privacy concerns. I think the law enforcement and national security mandate around the BSA sort of AML world is clear, but even in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there were certain significant countervailing privacy concerns about putting the financial system on the offense to find crime rather than simply let them to follow the money after the fact. I would argue that in the almost 20 years that have passed, the privacy concerns have only grown greater when we think about really proactive risk detection. And that puts the firms who have to do the risk detecting in an awkward place. Curious if you can speak a little bit about that balance and how it works or doesn't work, starting in the immediate 9/11 sort of period and to today.
PR, it's a great question because I think there are some fundamental policy tensions at play that we're all grappling with. Certainly the regulators on the call grapple with every day. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there was an extreme push toward the acquisition of as much data as possible and the ability to analyze it quickly, broadly, and even predictively, right? Now, again, 2001 technically looks much different than 2020 in terms of capabilities with machine learning, how we think about cloud services, how we think about encryption, right? So all of that was information, but really the driving principle was information sharing. And in fact, in the US government, PR, you may recall, we had something called the information sharing environment. So it was really driven by the fact that we were trying to break down walls, break down stovepipes, bring information together, and frankly, gather as much information as possible, including in the financial domain. And that put enormous pressure on financial institutions that had to respect different laws around the world, that had to respect different forms of bank secrecy, all with the principle that, of course, nobody wanted illicit activity happening within their jurisdiction or institution, but we had to find a balance. And, you know, something that's very interesting that happened in that evolution was a recognition that it was very hard to ask institutions to engage in enterprise-wide risk management, which again became the nomenclature and the driving principle in the anti-money laundering system. You've got to know your risk. You've got to understand what's happening in your enterprise. You've got to break down barriers, while at the same time respecting PII, respecting data localization laws, and respecting the fact that extreme transparency may not equate with security or with the policy goals that we have in mind. And as you said, PR, I think in the last couple of years, we've seen an acceleration of this with growing mistrust in institutions, growing difficulty in terms of creating these massive data lakes or these massive cloud systems to aggregate as much data as possible. And frankly, search for new technologies, including privacy enhancing technologies that allow us to square the circle of understanding and managing risk while also protecting and preserving data privacy and localization. And I think, again, that's where federated data analytics becomes so interesting and so potentially exquisite, because it begins to allow for risk awareness, risk revelation without moving data, without compiling the data, and with respect of privacy and data localization laws, all of which Gary can explain much better than I.
We're going to have Gary go very deep on those things. I want to lay out sort of a couple other aspects of where we are before we do that. I think we've covered well the sort of privacy challenges and some of the roadblocks that have existed in the road between 9/11 and today in terms of available technologies to solve these problems and some of the complexity of that. But the one thing we haven't mentioned is what happens to sort of the people who want to use the system, the people whose data is being screened. If you look at the sort of global BSA AML system now, you could arguably scan the world and see a system that is extremely costly to firms, both in the growth of their ERM, their enterprise risk management, and the sort of number of bodies and systems they support to meet sort of various sort of requirements, including filing all those SARs. We could see a system that doesn't do an extraordinarily efficient job of preventing financial crime, imposes sort of costs on other parties to sort of catch whatever it does catch, but may not be as good as it can or should be to prevent the misuse of the financial system, and has a very large sort of cost in who it excludes. That in part because of the extraordinary sort of pressure on firms to deliver compliant results, and their extraordinary concern about being associated with financial crime, not wanting to be a part of it, but also knowing that if they are, there's enormous regulatory trouble and fines and reputation damage that comes with it. What has happened to sort of firm strategic decision making as they think about where in the globe they want to do business, who they want to do business with, and what products they want to offer to whom?
PR, I think you're highlighting the extreme problem of blunt de-risking, which has emerged as a result of a lot of factors, but including the factors you've described, the pressure to make sure that institutions aren't touched or tainted by illicit actors, illicit activity. I think a simple way of thinking about this, PR, is the strategies that have been most sort of aggressive and kind of sharpened by the US government in particular, but even other governments now, are strategies of financial exclusion by design, right? Mm-hmm. They're intended to try to identify customers who are risky, lines of business that are risky, jurisdictions that are higher risk, and not necessarily by design to completely exclude the innocent, but certainly to create categories of risk that at a minimum require enhanced due diligence and other safeguards to make sure that the institution isn't importing that risk into the system. That, of course, has led to what you described, PR, which is institutions absenting themselves from particular customer types, particular markets, even whole geographies, because they don't feel like they have the visibility into where that risk lies. They may feel like they've been stung by regulatory and enforcement actions, and so they're risk averse by kind of dint of having been banged over the head with major fines, et cetera. But they also haven't had tools, frankly, to pierce the veil into these markets, into these correspondents, into other markets, to allow them to feel comfortable that they can actually manage this risk. You know, the consultants of the world like myself now that I'm on the outside, spend a lot of time with institutions on all sides of that equation to say, look, you've got to meet global standards. You've got to be able to demonstrate that you can hit those global standards. You've got to have governance processes, et cetera, in place The challenge, though, is the system is still very much based on elements of antiquated trust that are not fully trusted, right? And I think what the promise of this kind of a system brings for financial inclusion is the ability of institutions to actually know where risk is arising beyond known rules, beyond known localities. They can begin to engage even in higher risk corridors by applying some exquisite machine learning and the ability to access data sets that may have not been accessible before because you can't aggregate them, you can't pull them into your central repository. And so the really interesting thing about this technology, PR, is it begins to evolve where we've been, you know, this very difficult balance between you need institutions to exclude bad actors, but you don't want them to exclude high risk areas, customers, categories just because they're high risk, right? You need a balance. And I think all of us in the policy world who've worked in this space have always wanted to find that balance at a time when these issues, it's not as if anti-money laundering requirements are going to be lessened or there's going to be less use of sanctions or anything else is going to diminish in terms of the demands. The demands are only going to get more complicated. So the question is, what then is the design to allow us to bridge that gap?
So Gary, we need you. Help us design a better world for policymakers and regulators, a better world for the firms that want to do business in a variety of markets and geographies,
Sure.
and for people who rely on the financial system.
Sure.
So start by
Easy.
telling us, what is federated learning? How does it work?
Easy, just how to design a better world in about 7 minutes or less. No problem. Let me pick up where Juan left off, PR. And first of all, thanks to Melissa and PR and the FinRegLab team for inviting me, and for University of Michigan and the San Francisco Fed. I want to get to federated learning because I'm excited to talk about it, but I want to respond to the 3 points I just took from Juan's talk. So the first is that the BSA evolved after 9/11 from being reactive case building to being proactive and preventative. And so one of the takeaways that I would suggest that folks remember is we have to move our mindset from case building to lead generation or discovery. Okay, so these are terms that are going to be important in when I talk about technology. We want technology that's going to be good for lead generation or discovery, which is different than case building or investigation. Second is the other thing that happened post 9/11 in this paradigm shift that Juan didn't get into is he really, smartly talked about how after 9/11, we wanted to get all of the data together that we could, and we wanted to make massive piles of data. But what we did with the data was we did search, we did Control F, right? If you've ever worked on a, Microsoft software, you do Control F and type in a word, and if that word shows up in a document or a spreadsheet, you can find it. So that was our mentality after 9/11 is let's aggregate all of the data, and then we can do Control F and we can search for people across more data. I thought that was boring at the time, and I started working about 10 years ago or so on some government-funded research and development projects where we really asked this question of, is big data about the same analytics across more data, or is it qualitatively different? And it's qualitatively different, and it's in the area that I'm going to talk about, which is machine learning model training. Okay, so the second thing to remember is we move from search to model training, okay? The third thing is you and Juan just had this great conversation about privacy and financial exclusion. I just want to restate Juan's last sentence, and Juan, I hope it's okay, but I want to suggest a different word. We don't want to rebalance this idea of managing risk with financial exclusion. I think we want to get exquisite with measuring risk. And then we kind of don't have to think about the trade-off between privacy, security, and inclusion and exclusion. If we If we have exquisite measurement of risk, then we do not exclude groups of people based upon some label. The label could be some geography, some industry, some socioeconomic status. These are all bad reasons to include or exclude people. If we had exquisite measurement of risk, we wouldn't have to take broad groups of people and decide to include or exclude them. We could just measure risk for what it is, which is risk. So those are my three kind of reactions to Juan's comment, which leads into answering your question, PR, which is what is federated learning? So first I want to start with it. So federated learning, my bottom line up front, is it's a traveling algorithm. Okay, so if you want just a bumper sticker version to remember, it's a federated algorithm. But federated machine learning is inductive learning. Machine learning is learning by example. And this is the world we live in. Machine learning has impacted every aspect of your life and my life and everybody's life on this call, because we all have these smartphones and we all have smart appliances and smart everythings. So I'll start off with this, the assertion that if you think machine learning isn't going to pervade the world of anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism, you're wrong, because it's pervading everything and it will make it into how we measure risk. How we use machine learning to measure risk is, again, it's inductive. Inductive is a fancy way of saying learning by example. So to build, the opposite of inductive is deductive. Humans are deductive learners. Algorithms are not, or at least not yet. I think they won't become deductive learners. Lots of people disagree with me on that. But learning by example is, if I want to train a computer to recognize an image of a cat, which is the iconic example of machine learning. It's computer vision and it's Google's ability to identify photos of cats, a million photos in less than a second. There was a paper published by the authors of that algorithm, and they trained an algorithm on 10 million images of cats. So before you can start to train a computer to identify a cat, you have to feed it 10 million photos of cat and 10 million photos of not cat. And then it starts to get okay at distinguishing cat from not cat. So machine learning for identifying money laundering is the same idea. We need examples of money laundering. And then you can train a computer to identify money laundering from not money laundering. The alternative is deductive learning, and that's what you would do with one of your colleagues. You would train, let's say you have an internship program and you're hiring people out of college and you want to train them about money laundering. You give them a couple examples and they can deduce what money laundering might look like. Computers can't do that. They can't work on 2 or 3 examples. They need lots of data. So machine learning is data intensive. Okay, so if we're going to work in this world where more data is better, this second point of yours, PR, which is the privacy world. The reason we, after 9/11, wanted to create this big pile of data, and even today love to get more and more data, is because algorithms are better to the extent that they're trained on better data, because it's inductive learning. So more data is always better, because you need examples to learn from. You need training data. But we don't always want to pool our data. We don't want all of the banks of the world to share all of their data. We don't want everybody sharing all of their data. And I, as a human, don't want everybody in the world who has access to my data to be sharing it with other people without checking with me first, right? So how do we do machine learning? How do we learn by example and not share data? We share the algorithm. So that's what federated learning is. It's the traveling algorithm. It's moving to a world, and this is the innovation that hasn't happened yet in our world. We are going to create the ability to share algorithms. So if you're a bank or if you're a central bank, think about a world in which you're not writing up a typology and publishing it and putting out in a PDF and sending it out to banks and hoping that they read it and it goes into their modeling system, and within 12 months they've got a new model based upon the document you've sent out. Think about a world in which we collaborate by keeping data at home, keeping data private, keeping data secure, but sharing model weights and parameters. And that's what the promise of federated learning is all about.
Question for you about that, because it's an elegant idea. But if you think about current state, you know, the Bank of Gary, the Bank of Juan, and the Bank of PR all have relatively sophisticated models today for risk identification. It may be that all of those models can be improved. So if we had a traveling algorithm that could visit each of those institutions and learn by induction, as you described,
Yes.
what data gaps are we improving? What kind of data will a federated system have better access to that we currently don't have the benefit of?
So I don't know how good our current system is. You started that question with the assertion that all of the banks have good models. We don't measure model performance today. We measure SAR filing rate, which is totally different than model performance. So first of all, let me start by saying we don't really know how good the current system is. We know that it's incredibly expensive. We know that we catch almost none of the global money laundering going on a percentage basis. And we know that it leads to unintended consequences such as financial exclusion. So I am not going to jump up and down and say the current system is pretty good. I'll say it's pretty expensive. But that's the only empirical evidence that I have. What are we going to get by moving to a machine learning world? We're going to get precision and recall. We're going to get more true positives, fewer false positives, and we're going to get, incredibly important here, we're going to get a dynamic learning system. Right now we have bad precision and recall, bad true positives, bad false positives, and we have static systems that change once a year at most. And the criminal element, they can change their tactics, techniques, and procedures overnight. And our rules inside of our financial institutions change very slowly.
Let me press you a little bit just on the kinds of data that,
please.
There seems to be, there are categories of data that the current system, however good or not good it is, simply isn't designed to capture. And it goes to this training by example. Whatever models we have, it seems to me, they're likely to be training on data sets that have a lot more false positives than true positives. And a federated learning model, including one with a hub that is a government agency, like our proverbial central bank of the future, has a particularly interesting set of data to inform the system with, which is the law enforcement data.
That's right.
Whatever feedback there is today, and that certainly, when we talk about privacy regulation, I don't think of that type of data, although it's subject to enormous restraints that restrict sharing in this context. But if we give firms the benefit of more real information about what is crime, they will be able to
That's right.
train those models better and have better risk detection, right?
So at PR's bank, it's a very, very big, very sophisticated bank. The best you can do in an inductive learning world, in a learning by example world, is you take last year's SARs and you build your models based upon those. If last year's SARs are at least 95% false positives, which they probably are, you're building a more efficient way to create low quality data. And that is not a noble purpose. That's not what we're in it for, right?
Agreed.
So what we want to do is, if you think about the central bank of the future, is if that central bank were to provide not the PII for the ground truth, you need training data. The central bank of the future can work with law enforcement, can work with government agencies and get training data, and either share that in an anonymized way or just share the weights and parameters of the model. These are the patterns of behavior that are highly correlated with the money launderers that we caught of the last year. If it's a national priority to go after certain types of criminal behavior, OxyContin online sales, and that's like a national priority. The government could share models of what that behavior might look like, not in terms of names and addresses and phone numbers of people arrested and convicted, but actual model weights and parameters. And those can be shared, no PII, no privacy concerns, even for those convicted, no privacy concerns. And it allows for collaboration. Allowing for collaboration is really the key to this. Back to Juan's point, we built a system in which law enforcement, I spent a couple of years in law enforcement. We collaborate with each other. We call each other up, be like, hey, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? We don't allow the banks to do that because of the privacy constraints on them. Sharing the model allows for that collaboration, which is how we get that step function increase in efficiency and effectiveness.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Let me pause for 1 second and encourage our many participants in the panel to ask questions. We're standing by to respond to your good thinking. So just add them into the chat, and I and the FinRegLab team will sort of get them to our panelists and work them in. I want to shift gears slightly. Having heard the benefits of collaboration and sort of a networked approach to risk identification, I want to sort of wear the hat of someone who sits on top of an enterprise risk management program, who owns the risk when a technology fails, and ask the two of you to consider, what is it that I should be worried about? What are good questions to have about this technology? What are the right questions to be asking? And what are the ones that, whether it's about privacy leaks or information security, or what are the things that I need to consider if I wanted to shift to a federated learning sort of approach to my BSA sort of risk identification?
I'm happy to take a first crack at that, PR, if you like. We work, obviously, prior when we were in government, but obviously now outside of government with clients all around the world, and we deal with chief risk officers and chief compliance officers and GCs all over the world in different size institutions. I think there's probably a category of 3 things that Gary and I have encountered as we've evangelized this idea to folks and certainly thought about how it applies. I think the first question is, how does it apply with my current system? To your point, PR, a lot of institutions think they do things pretty well. They're getting relatively good or passing grades from their regulator. And so there's a little bit of institutional resistance to trying to do something that's just different, that may not be called for by the regulator or may not even be rewarded by the regulator.
Indeed.
Right? So
battleships are hard to turn.
Exactly. So the first question I would have if I'm sitting in an institution is, well, how does this fit into what I'm doing? So I'm not exposing myself, and certainly I'm trying to improve my system. So I think there are clear answers to that. I think part of that is fitting this model onto existing models to start, and informing risk models internally, risk weighting, and other activities. And we're seeing that with one of the pilots that Gary and I are working on here in the United States with a couple of financial institutions. So that's doable, but that's a serious question. How does it fit with the current systems and models? 2, I think there is an important question analytically, and Gary grapples with this every day, about how you think about the dynamism of the model, because it is dynamic. You think about this like and I'm a simpleton in this. So PR, I use the analogy of a bee or a hive that's pollinating, or taking the benefit of, let's say, flowers or trees, and the bee is the algorithm, and you can have several of these functioning within an ecosystem at any one time. You can imagine a central bank of the future that has an algorithm factory or library that it's deploying or that its members are leveraging, and it's a constant swirl and buzz of these bees and these algorithms that are traveling and learning and dynamically doing that. I think it's an interesting question, something Gary and I are grappling with about the governance. At what point do you take the output and then leverage the output for the members of the network? What are the points at which you stop the model to make sure the output makes sense and that you're risk weighting it properly, et cetera? So that's a serious question, and one that comes with the evolution of the model and the governance. but again, manageable and quite interesting. The third, I think, would be how does this fundamentally translate into the shared risk, shared cost, utility-like model that this technology promises? Because in its final form, really this technology does allow for more of a utility-like functionality, whether it's through a central bank or within a payment ecosystem or in a consortium of financial institutions, or even, you know, high-risk corridors, et cetera. How does that sort of step function leap forward take place? And again, the answer, I think, is by experimentation, pilots, demonstration of value, and certainly regulatory participation in some of these to be able to inform how it plays out. But in my mind, those are some of the questions that we've encountered, and certainly things that I would be asking if I'm in an institution.
Gary, do you want to add to that, or? Okay.
Sorry, I was
I want
on
to ask
mute.
one.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think, no, go ahead too, because there's some other questions from the
I want to
from the
ask one
group as well.
follow-up question, because you know, we talk about federated learning as a privacy-enhancing technology, and if
Yes.
I'm, you know, a general counsel or a chief risk officer of a bank, I'm concerned about that assertion on a couple of levels. Like, one, just general privacy leaks. Two, your traveling algorithm visits me and then all of my friends. So, and I know my friends in the marketplace have awfully smart data scientists, and you share weights and parameters and other information. Can they reverse engineer facts about my business that I don't want them to have for competitive reasons that aren't technically privacy problems, but, you know, collaboration could come with competitive cost. You know, I think we've done a good job on the benefit side, but are there anything, any concerns of those kinds that are still live questions that research or prototyping or other things are still needed on?
Yeah, that's a great question, PR. So the only thing that's come up is, as Juan said, we have a couple of banks already participating with us right now in the current phase of our experimentation. And the only objection that was initially raised was that last one, which is competitive intelligence. So are you gonna, if we're building a model for food trucks, what are you going to know about my food truck population that you might be able to use for your benefit to try to steal the food truck population from me? And I think at the end, everybody realized that that's a very trivial concern. It would be really hard to do. And so banks have decided to move forward. Now, when we're at 20 banks, it's going to be impossible to do that. Or if theoretically, I can't imagine how you would do that. So if you had 20 banks, and so you get a food truck algorithm at PR's bank, how you're going to know what Juan's population looks like versus the other 18 banks is going to be practically impossible to do.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you a sort of similar question that came in from our audience, and I'll call out the question and our colleague who submitted it and let them chime in with a follow-up. It follows up on your point around sort of exquisite risk prediction and poses a specific example to you, Gary. Christopher Calabria has asked, how important is transaction size in using federated learning to spot potential money laundering? This is where context matters. In some countries, a transaction of $15 to $30 average or across a mobile network may be sort of what you're mining for the sort of odd indications or rare indications of a financial crimes risk. You know, in another market, the numbers, how you would set that part of the inquiry up would look dramatically differently, because, you know, a $15 to $30 transaction size is not, you know, primarily what you're looking for.
Right.
You know, you're looking for multi-million dollars.
So I think it's a great question. What matters in inductive learning is not any specific trait, but it's kind of the combination of traits and the uniqueness, right? So we're looking for signal in the noise, to use a cliche. And if you're in the rules-based world, you might, you know, be looking for $15 to $30 transactions. In a machine learning world, you're going to look for training data that allows you to identify a pattern that's unique. So you want to look across multiple parameters of your internal data, you want to augment it with external data or other contextual data, and you want to build that model based upon as many parameters as you can. So what matters is not the size of the parameter, but the number of parameters you have for training. So that's the short answer, Christopher. It's not the size of any one parameter. It's how many parameters you have for training. So going back to my cat analogy, it didn't matter that the algorithm was trained to identify cats, that there were a lot of cats in the world, that there were a few cats in the world, that there was a lot of variety of cats in the world. What matters is they had 10 million images of cats and 10 million images of not cats. And that's how they trained the algorithm. So think about it in terms of the scarcity is in training data. And in order to move into this machine learning world in the way that we're talking about, we're going to need to figure out where is the training data for model building. And it's about getting a rich array of training data.
That's very helpful. I have sort of a related conceptual question about the origins of this, or sort of an analogy for federated learning from Corey Nance, who asked whether this concept of a shared algorithm for risk identification purposes comes from the same place, or is similar to the sharing of firewall logs in the sort of information security world, where you're crowdsourcing information about bad actors and bad transactions to get that network effect.
Yeah, it's another great question, Corey. We're not sharing hard identifiers. So a hard identifier is at Gary Shiffman, or at so-and-so, or Gary Shiffman at 123 Main Street. So a lot of the firewall logs is showing the hard identifiers, like the IP addresses and things like that. What we're sharing are the patterns of behavior. Now, to the extent that the pattern of behavior is a part of the analytic in the firewall, the collaboration in the firewall world, then yeah, this is a similar idea, but we're preserving all of that PII and not sharing it. So we're not sharing the hard identifiers, and that's where I think the difference would be.
PR, if I could just add here, I think one interesting analogy really does come from the cyber world. You see this from a policy perspective, where there's been much more interest on the part of regulators in terms of public-private coordination around much more active information sharing. As Gary said, in that context, cyber tends to be very actor-specific or malware-specific, but there has been a shift in mindset around what that information sharing looks like, in part because in the financial sector, institutions are all affected by the same kinds of actors, the same kinds of ransomware, the same kind of malware. And usually that's dynamic risk, right? It happens overnight and can be, existential for an institution. So there's been more kind of a conceptual aperture for thinking about more aggressive information sharing models in terms of cybersecurity, that I think it certainly has informed the way I've thought about this and the way we've thought about the construct. Although importantly here, it's really important to keep in mind, we are not talking necessarily in the front end about transaction resolution or entity resolution. We're talking about the trends and the weights and parameters that Gary's described. And it's frankly a much different conception of information sharing. Whereas in the past, again, even law enforcement, the HIFCA task forces, the things we've set up over time within the USG has largely been around actor-specific questions, very particular cases, and trying to share spreadsheets, frankly, around data and data sharing. This is very different because we're talking about the creation of algorithms and weights and parameters that in essence becomes the core of information sharing as opposed to the PII itself.
Excellent, thank you. As we move to our last 10 minutes, I thought we should put our sort of policy and designers, architects of a better world hat on it, and really think through, if we want to have a world in which a central bank or a law enforcement agency can bring this concept to life. What kind of tools do they need? What kind of technological tools do they need? What kind of legal and regulatory tools do they need? And how do they do it if you're someone like me who wants to see that central bank of the future take up real sort of policy mandates around financial inclusion? How do we make sure that's a piece of the puzzle in what ensues?
So I can talk about the technology side and defer to others to think about, the regulatory and legal side. From a technology perspective, this is not difficult. You need a central hub, and that's what Juan and I created a company called Conciliant to do that, to build out that central hub. And that central hub performs three functions: aggregation, validation, and orchestration, AVO. So you need to aggregate the input from all of the nodes. You need to validate the input from each of the nodes. And then you need to orchestrate the traveling aspect of the traveling algorithms. So there's going to be a library of algorithms which travel. So aggregation, validation, orchestration. You need participating financial institutions to agree to participate. And so they have to have a host. They have to have a place where the algorithm can show up, learn, and leave. And that's really it. So from an engineering perspective, the central bank of the future would need to think about that central node, the aggregation, validation, orchestration node, and ways to incentivize banks to participate. Now, I'm sure Juan and PRU and Melissa and others who have spent time in the Treasury Department have all kinds of other thoughts on how to make that happen. But from a technology perspective, it's pretty clear.
I have one question for you about the oversight of the technology perspective. We can start there, perhaps. If you have a sort of government actor in the center, in the hub, or even if you don't, what kind of tools, oversight tools, do they need to make sure that there aren't manipulations of the data, right? You're using the training data of localized actors. Your algorithm travels. You don't have total control over the data they're looking at. Are there metrics or other kinds of tools that need to be in place to sort of monitor for data poisoning or other kinds of manipulation of the algorithm?
Yeah, I think the validation function, remember I said there's aggregation, validation, orchestration. The validation function needs to be robust. There needs to be human in the loop for a validation function. I would not automate that and have never advocated for that. And I think there could be another discussion or a study on what validation means. But just for the purpose of this conversation, we're not inventing machine learning for the purposes of AML. Machine learning is already pervading all of our lives, and validation is being addressed everywhere. And we just need to be a part of those validation conversations. So in the ANPRM from that FinCEN just put out, I just submitted a response to that, talking about how do you actually measure effectiveness? How do you measure efficiency? How do you measure bias? There are ways to do this. This is not new science or new math we have to invent. We just have to make sure that we build a validation function that addresses things like bias and also addresses things like financial inclusion. Getting back to the big picture question you and Melissa are asking us is, if we have exquisite measurement of risk, which is what I'm all about, we get financial inclusion, and we can measure those things, and we need to measure those things. And in fact, that's what FinRegLab, I mean, to me, the promise of FinRegLab and the agenda you all are taking on is about making sure that as we measure our ability to identify financial criminals, we are also simultaneously measuring financial inclusion. It needs to be built in.
PR, if I can just raise two quick points on the security issues. I think you're right to point that out, because those are issues, especially if you think about this going to scale. That said, the technologies out there that's being developed, we have Intel as a partner, the chip maker, which has devoted extensive engineering to the chip level security. They've got a system called SGX, and the network and node security for a federated analytic architecture. And so Gary and I, in working on our pilots, are working with Intel on how you build it to scale, how you automate it, and how you secure it. And so I think there are already solutions evolving around how we think about security, and Gary's point, ultimately how we get to validation. The other point I would make is, to your broader question, I think we have to race toward risk here, right? I think there are some interesting experiments that can be done relatively quickly to demonstrate where we can cut the Gordian knot, right? We can meet these policy goals. So for example, we have focused a lot of policy attention, for example, on Somali remittances, right? The unbanked Somali diaspora in the US, the UK, the fact that, you know, most of the money that's going into Somaliland and Somalia goes in via cash. It's very hard for banking and banks to get comfortable with the last mile of assurance. There's some interesting experiments that can be had between like-minded regulators and select private sector actors that have an interest in making sure that capital gets into high-risk areas. It doesn't have to be Somalia, that's very high risk. But I talked to you about this, PR. We've had conversations with DFID in the UK. You can imagine aid agencies being very interested in what the movement of financial resources, remittances, and other things mean to high-risk zones, and how this system plays into it. That's the high order version of this, but I think you could pilot that very easily, and I think you just need to have the regulators of the same mind working together on enabling it.
One further question around, you know, the mechanism by which we achieve financial inclusion. I take your point, Gary, that we need some thinking around how to measure it. How do we know what these technological solutions are contributing towards inclusion? But what exactly is the mechanism? We get better risk identification. We even in a good day will be exquisitely measuring risk. We'll sort of narrow the over capture when we're looking for risky people or risky transactions, so fewer people get thrown out when they're not actually at risk. So that's one way we create space for inclusion. But if part of where we started was, you know, firms are making macro risk decisions about strategic engagement in certain markets, regulators don't often have direct tools over that. Is the mechanism for inclusion here that we're creating space to serve populations safely, and that will, you know, when markets work, the firms, either incumbents or new firms, will be drawn into that, or are there other ways that this can affect inclusion more directly?
If I were the chief risk officer at a large financial institution, and I knew that I had the top cover from my examiners and my regulators to move into this space, I would want to be able to demonstrate performance. This idea of metrics is so important to me, because I think we have this inefficient system today because we're not measuring outcomes. We're measuring inputs, but not outcomes. We're measuring SARS filed, but not criminal activity. If the central bank of the future had, I talked about training data, but had test data, right? Where you could measure how I'm doing, not how many SARs I filed. You shouldn't care about how many SARs I filed. You should care about, are my SARs good? You should care about, do I have a system that catches risky behavior? If you have test data and you can do that, and I can convince myself and you that my system is working effectively and efficiently, then I can go to some of these jurisdictions that Juan is talking about. I could go to underserved populations anywhere in the world, including in the United States. And I could provide banking products to them because I no longer have to worry about labeling a large group of people, which is one of the things that just makes me, and I think everybody else, angry when we take a label and we apply it to a broad group of people. That's exactly what we do in banking, and we need to get out of that. So if we could just demonstrate exquisite measurement of risk, we can provide banking products to so many more people.
Excellent. On that note, I want to invite every single person who's participated in the panel today to join a continuing conversation. We at FinRegLab are working to stand up research in this area to understand what questions need answers and pathways for making this an idea that comes from our whiteboard to a real piece of research. So we invite you to visit our website, FinRegLab.org, where there's information and ways to contact me and my colleagues with all of your good ideas. the San Francisco Federal Reserve team, the University of Michigan team, all of our participants, and especially Gary and Juan, you have my deep gratitude, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, PR.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody.
Hey, thank you, everyone, for your questions. Thank you, PR Stark, Juan Zarate, and Gary Shiffman for today's presentation. This was truly a fascinating discussion. Give all of our speakers a round of applause here. Before you go, I'd like to share just a couple of reminders. First, please tomorrow at 9 a.m. Pacific time and 12 Eastern time, after our opening remarks, we'll have Timothy Massad, a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and former chairman of the CFTC, deliver today's first keynote. And second, please do make sure to log into the Engagement Hub early to receive your daily activation code in time for the sessions to start. So you can make sure you get in there and you can ask whatever questions for the panels. Once you're in the Engagement Hub, we also encourage you to explore the additional resources tab. There you'll find papers and videos on various topics covered in the conference. Thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of the day.